Hi, my name is Thelma Robinson, and I'm a current graduate student at Indiana University Northwest in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. In collaboration with Partners in Conversation, Grads Talk for Change will be discussing policy in relation to economic concepts. Marcus Williams of the Lake County Clerk's Office has joined the conversation to offer insight and awareness on current processes for domestic violence victims, as well as current policies that address domestic violence offenders. Marcus, can you give a brief overview of your relevance to today's topic?
Well, I've been employed here with the Lake County Clerk's Office for approximately 7 years. And over those 7 years, we've seen many cases of domestic violence type of cases that were coming through the clerk's office is definitely nothing foreign to us. So we've seen it all and heard all of the stories regarding domestic violence here in Lake County.
Thank you. So, overview of the issue. In Indiana, more than half of deaths that occur in domestic violence situations are with firearms. State Representative Vernon Smith created a policy aimed at firearm surrenders. House Bill 1297 was the proposed gun reform bill to reduce the likelihood of offenders receiving or maintaining a firearm who possess a Class A misdemeanor for domestic violence crimes. The hope is that government intervention will decrease the amount of gun-related domestic violence fatalities. So key points and takeaways that you will get from this conversation is that you'll be able to distinguish the residential benefits from the policy being enacted. You will also have a better idea and be able to determine whether gun reforms impact a society. You'll also be more knowledgeable about the current processes for an individual who is charged with the Class A misdemeanor. And it is my hope that you will also know the cost of implementing a policy to control gun possession by Class A misdemeanor offenders. So currently in Indiana, they do not require universal background checks. In fact, in 1996, US Code 922 G9 was implemented to bar domestic violence criminals, domestic misdemeanor criminals, from bearing firearms. Indiana did not adopt this code into their state code of conduct. But in 2017, they did pass legislation which allows law enforcement to disarm at-risk individuals. So this is a graph from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, Office of Strategic Intelligence and Information, and it shows firearm recovery used in criminal acts by year. So as you can see, in 2014, between 2014 and 2017, when the policy was enacted, you see a steadily increase of individuals who had felonies or for whatever reason were not supposed to have firearms. They were firearms recovered in those situations. So it shows that policy does impact firearms in some way. Indiana's 2012 to 2013 domestic violence fatality report shows that 62% of fatalities in domestic violence situations occurred by firearms. This is significantly important because we are trying to curb the rate of domestic violence fatalities, and firearms are a significant contributing factor to that issue. So before I ask you a few key questions, Marcus, I just want to discuss can you give me a brief overview of the process for firearm surrenders by an individual in a domestic violence situation?
Okay, sure, absolutely. So the way we understand it is that once a call comes out and the police department shows up for a domestic violence call, and obviously if they're taking the call serious, there's something that legitimately happened here. No one is just wasting the officer's time. There is an ask, and where the firearm, and then they confiscate the firearm, and the police hold them at the police department. And of course, they run tests on them, make sure they were not used in other crimes or what have you. But this is done in an effort to keep the rate of injury by firearm at a bare minimum. So you just take the firearm from them.
So just to make sure I'm understanding you, is this only in instances where an individual calls in and says that that person has a firearm, or is this in any instance?
Well, the firearm procedure, especially if they legally own their firearm, is within the system. So the police officer knows when they're going into a home that there's a registered gun permit located within the home. So
Okay,
then they're more apt to look into this and ask for the firearm.
okay, thank you. And I just wanted to know, do you feel that that's effective in reducing domestic fatalities currently?
Yes, yes, I believe that has greatly helped. Once I remove an instrument away from you that you cannot use, it helps keep the mortality rate high.
So we talked a little bit about House Bill 1297, and similar policies has been enacted in other cities. Do you believe that implementing a policy such as House Bill 1297 will curb the rate of domestic violence caused by firearms?
Yes, I feel as if you take the vessel away from individuals, that will curb that rate of domestic violence use of firearms. So anything that can get that out of the hands of either of the individuals will greatly reduce the chance of violence that way.
Okay, and so Lake County produces very high rates of homicides and suicides by misdemeanor domestic violence offenders, as you may know. From your experience in office, how likely are individuals with protective orders to escalate?
It happens. There are individuals who receive that protective order and it sends them into a higher range than they were before, which is why here at our office, the protective order is issued to the person that is told to stay away by the sheriff's department and not by another individual as of the post office or anything like that. So the sheriff's department or a local police department will deliver that protective order to say, stay away.
And is there anything you might add or take away from this policy to ensure its benefits?
The only thing that I would say, and I'm just speaking for myself, is if there's a situation where one person's leaving the home, I would want to know where they're going and are there firearms where they're going? Because I do not want you to go to a relative or a friend's home where there is firearms, and then now you're borrowing that firearm to come back and do damage. So I would just bar the person from wherever they're going from being in a facility where there's firearms.
So off camera, I had a conversation with Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas Mahoney, and he gave me a little more insight to the legality of the issue, and I came up with a few externalities of this policy because, with everything, there can be unintended consequences. Um, so one thing that he discussed is the diversion program. So a lot of misdemeanor cases go through diversion programs, which is an alternative route to actually receiving a conviction. And how might that affect a individual who does not really know the status of their conviction, and they go and fill out a form and then they receive a felony because they didn't know whether or not they had been charged, and they put on the information that they're not this, and so it leads to a bigger issue in getting a firearm.
Yes, that is definitely an issue. I call it the land of unintended consequences. So if you don't know your status, whether or not you are legally able to obtain a firearm, I would suggest that individuals within the state of Indiana to contact the Indiana State Police Department to get that answered.
So let's talk a little bit before we get to the end of this lovely conversation. Let's talk a little bit about opportunity cost. So that's the cost of giving up something to acquire a good or service. So we want to implement this policy. We're implementing this policy. What are some things that you feel would we be giving up in exchange for implementing House Bill 1297?
I feel like that there's always going to be a sacrifice with anything, but as long as the greater good is of saving lives, whatever that sacrifice is, we should be willing to do to stomach that for a while. As long as it's not something that's going to make you homeless, prevent you from feeding your family, as long as it's not that, you should be okay.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. And so just a reflection on our conversation, we talked about the impact of policy on gun violence. We also talked about current procedures that are aimed at gun reform for domestic violence offenders. And we talked a little bit about things that we give up to implement such a policy. And I want to ask you this personally, do you really believe that it's a benefit for House Bill 1297?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I would say if with House Bill 1297, if there are things within House Bill 1297 that aims to ultimately protect the life of fools. And if that is the ultimate goal, then this should definitely pass unanimously on both chambers of our government.
Well, I thank you, Marcus, and I'm sorry we don't have a lot of time to discuss more into this issue. It's a really good topic, and hopefully we'll be able to have further dialogue on this. I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me, and I look forward to further conversation. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for having me.